The crystal wine glass exploded across the marble floor before anyone even realized what had happened, and every conversation inside Ashcroft University's Grain Heritage Library died at once. I still remember the sound because it wasn't just glass breaking. It was the exact moment everyone in that room decided what kind of people they really were. "On your knees," Preston Langford barked, loud enough for every donor, trustee, professor, and television camera to hear. "You don't touch something that people like you could never afford." If you had walked into that room right then, you would have assumed the woman standing in front of him had committed some terrible crime. Instead, all 61-year-old Martha Dawson had done was move an illuminated medieval manuscript away from a faulty display lamp after she'd smelled insulation burning. Martha had worked nights as one of the university's custodians for almost 2 decades, wearing the same faded gray uniform every evening, quietly pushing the same cleaning cart through halls most students barely noticed. She wasn't loud. She wasn't political. She wasn't the kind of person people remembered 5 minutes after passing her in a hallway. That's exactly why Preston thought he could make an example out of her. Preston Langford wasn't just another wealthy donor. His family's name was carved into half the buildings on campus. The business school carried his father's name. The law library carried his grandfather's. Every university president for the last 30 years had somehow managed to become his close personal friend. And everyone knew if Preston picked up his phone, careers could disappear before lunch. Standing beside him was his daughter Caroline, dressed in a designer evening gown, already recording everything with her phone while trying not to laugh too loudly. "Dad," she whispered with a grin, "this is going viral." The dean glanced toward the cameras, then toward Martha, then quietly looked away. Nobody wanted to be the first person to disagree with a man who donated 8 figures every few years. Preston snatched the manuscript from Martha's hands so violently that one corner bent against the leather binding. "Do you even know what this is?" he sneered. Martha opened her mouth just slightly, then closed it again. "That's what I thought," he continued. 18 years pushing a mop and suddenly you think you're qualified to touch 400-year-old history? Several guests laughed nervously. Others stared into their wine glasses, pretending they couldn't hear him. Martha never looked angry. That was the strange part. She simply watched the manuscript, not Preston, almost like she was calculating damage nobody else could even see. "Answer me," Preston demanded. She quietly replied, "The lamp was overheating. I didn't want the parchment exposed." He actually laughed. Listen to her. Now she's pretending to be an expert. Caroline zoomed her phone closer. "Say something else," she giggled. "This is gold." Then Preston did something I don't think even he fully understood. He opened the manuscript, grabbed one page, and ripped it straight down the center. The sound wasn't loud, but somehow it echoed through that enormous library louder than the orchestra still playing in the background. Martha inhaled sharply. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't panic. It sounded more like someone watching an old friend get hurt. Preston wasn't finished. He tore another page, then another. Tiny fragments drifted through the air like confetti before landing across Martha's shoulders. Her gray uniform, even her silver hair. "There," he said proudly. "Now it's about as valuable as you are." Caroline couldn't stop laughing. The dean quietly signaled the musicians to keep playing. Nobody moved. Nobody stepped in. The cameras kept rolling because public humiliation makes good television. Then Preston pointed toward the floor. "Pick it up." Martha slowly lowered herself onto one knee. Caroline smiled triumphantly, convinced she'd finally broken this old woman in front of everyone. But Martha never looked at Preston. Not once. She carefully gathered each tiny piece of parchment with both hands, almost the way someone would pick up pieces of a family photograph after a tornado. She unfolded a clean white linen cloth from her apron pocket and wrapped every fragment individually with astonishing care. Watching her, I remember thinking something didn't fit. Most people would have been crying. Some would have been yelling. Others would have quit on the spot. Martha acted like the room no longer existed, like there was only the damaged manuscript and the responsibility sitting quietly in her hands. As she stood, Preston smirked. "That's better. Know your place." She simply nodded once and softly replied, "I always have." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't surrender either. Somehow it sounded like something completely different, though none of us understood it yet. She placed the wrapped fragments inside her cleaning cart, apologized to absolutely nobody, and slowly continued down the corridor while violins filled the silence everyone else was too afraid to break. Behind her, the gala resumed almost immediately. Champagne glasses clinked again. Donors laughed again. Television crews interviewed Preston about his generous commitment to preserving American history. By midnight, every local news station was praising his philanthropy. Nobody mentioned the woman in the janitor's uniform. Nobody mentioned the destroyed manuscript. Nobody cared what happened after the cameras left. But sometime around 12:30 that morning, long after the ballroom lights went dark and the security guards settled into their overnight routines, Martha quietly pushed her cleaning cart into a forgotten storage room beneath the east wing. She checked the hallway twice before kneeling beside an old mop bucket, reaching behind it, and pulling out a small locked walnut case, so worn it looked older than half the books upstairs. She rested one trembling hand across the lid, took a slow breath, and whispered words no one else was there to hear. "I hoped I'd never have to open you again." Then she turned the brass key. The brass lock clicked open with a sound so familiar it almost made Martha smile, though nobody was there to see it. Inside the walnut case lay instruments that had been sleeping for 18 years, each wrapped exactly the way she had packed them the last time she believed she would ever restore another manuscript. Bone folders polished smooth by decades of use. Japanese tissue so thin it almost disappeared against the wood. Tiny surgical tweezers. Handmade brushes. Linen thread. Reed starch paste sealed in glass jars. Magnifying lenses. Cotton gloves yellowed by time. None of them belonged to a janitor, and yet every one of them seemed to recognize her hands the moment she touched them. "Well," she whispered with the faintest laugh, "let's see if either of us remembers how to do this." She carried everything to a forgotten workbench tucked behind old shelving where broken furniture was stored, switched on a single desk lamp, and gently unfolded the linen cloth holding the torn fragments. For the first time since Preston had ripped the pages apart, she allowed herself to feel something. Her fingers trembled. Her eyes watered. Not because Preston had humiliated her. She'd lived through worse things than cruel men with money. But because the manuscript itself had survived wars, fires, floods, careless collectors, and centuries of history, only to be shredded in less than 20 seconds by someone who claimed to love culture. "I'm sorry," she murmured to the book, almost as if apologizing to an old friend. Then the years melted away. The hesitant movements disappeared. Her back straightened. Her breathing slowed. The old rhythm returned one motion at a time until the elderly custodian standing in a basement storage room was gone, replaced by the woman who had once been considered one of the finest manuscript conservators in America. Each fragment was aligned under magnification. Fibers were matched like pieces of an impossible puzzle. Moisture levels were adjusted by instinct. Tiny tears, invisible to the naked eye, disappeared beneath paper so delicate even breathing too hard could destroy it. Hours slipped past unnoticed. Upstairs, the university slept. Rain tapped softly against stained glass windows while the ancient clock tower marked each passing hour. But Martha barely heard any of it. Around 3 in the morning, Officer Ben Ramirez from campus security made his usual patrol downstairs. He paused outside the storage room after noticing the light. "Miss Dawson?" he asked gently. "Everything okay?" Martha looked up with a guilty smile. "Sorry, Ben. Didn't mean to worry you." He stepped inside and froze. What is all this?" She looked at the tools spread across the table before quietly answering, "A part of my life I promised myself I'd never revisit." Ben had known Martha for almost 12 years. She remembered every birthday. She baked cookies for the overnight maintenance crew every Christmas. She once spent 3 nights sitting with him after his father passed away because she knew grief hated empty rooms. Yet somehow he realized in that moment he had never really known who she was. "You know how to fix that?" he asked, staring at the manuscript. Martha simply nodded. "I used to." Ben leaned closer, watching her hands. "Used to where?" She smiled without looking up. "Washington." "Doing what?" "Saving books people couldn't replace." That answer raised more questions than it solved. But Ben sensed she wasn't ready to tell the rest. So instead, he quietly walked to the hallway, locked the basement entrance, and hung an out-of-service sign on the door. When he returned, he placed a fresh cup of coffee beside her without saying another word. "Nobody comes down here until morning," he said. Martha looked at him for a long moment before softly replying, "Thank you." By sunrise, the final repair disappeared beneath careful burnishing. The manuscript looked untouched. Unless someone viewed it under specialized laboratory equipment, no one would ever know what had happened. Martha closed the cover with both hands and let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for 18 years. She wasn't smiling because she'd performed a miracle. She was smiling because she'd remembered who she used to be. At exactly 8:30 the next morning, Preston Langford arrived with 2 television crews, 3 photographers, the university's public relations director, and enough makeup artists to prepare for a political debate. His plan was simple. He would stage a dramatic moment where he publicly forgave the frightened janitor, announce another multi-million-dollar donation for historical preservation, and walk away looking like a compassionate leader who occasionally lost his temper but ultimately had a generous heart. "Where's the woman?" he asked impatiently. Nobody knew. Dean Russell Avery looked nervous. "We're trying to locate her." Preston checked his watch. "Find her. Cameras aren't waiting all day." Caroline adjusted her designer sunglasses and reviewed the clip she'd recorded the night before. "Social engagement is already insane," she said proudly. "People love this stuff." "Good," Preston replied. "We'll give them a redemption story now." Downstairs, Martha quietly returned every tool to the walnut case. She cleaned each one before placing it back exactly where it belonged. Then she locked the case, slid it behind the mop bucket again, picked up her cleaning cart, and headed upstairs for another ordinary workday. Nobody stopped her. Nobody recognized what had happened overnight. At 9 o'clock sharp, the cameras rolled. Preston stood beside the display case with a carefully rehearsed expression of humility. "Last night," he announced dramatically, "emotions got the better of me. We all make mistakes. Today I'd like to show the importance of forgiveness." An assistant opened the display case. Preston reached inside and lifted the manuscript with the confidence of a man certain he controlled every outcome. Then he opened it. Silence. His smile vanished so completely it looked as though someone had erased it from his face. Every page was perfect. Every tear had disappeared. Every edge aligned flawlessly. The camera operators exchanged confused glances. Dean Avery stepped closer. "That's impossible," he whispered. Preston turned pages faster, then slower, then back again. "Who touched this?" he demanded. Nobody answered because nobody knew. Caroline grabbed the book from him, staring at it in disbelief. "Dad, this is the same one." "No," Preston snapped. "It can't be." "It is." For the first time in years, uncertainty entered his voice. "Find the conservator." "We don't have one," the dean replied quietly. Preston looked ready to explode again when the massive oak doors at the far end of the library swung open. Every head turned. 3 men and a woman entered wearing dark suits. The man in front displayed a federal identification badge before anyone could ask questions. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. The room became silent the moment people recognized the badge. He scanned the library once, his eyes passing over donors, professors, trustees, photographers, and finally resting on the restored manuscript. Then he spoke one calm sentence that drained every ounce of color from Preston Langford's face. "I'm Special Agent Daniel Mercer with the National Cultural Heritage Protection Office. I need to speak with the person who restored that manuscript last night." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Preston forced an awkward laugh. "Actually, Agent, we're still trying to determine how." Mercer cut him off without raising his voice. "I didn't ask who owns the building." His eyes never left the manuscript. "I asked who restored it." Ben Ramirez slowly stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He hesitated only a second before pointing toward the long eastern corridor. Every face turned at once. At the far end, almost hidden by morning sunlight pouring through stained glass windows, Martha Dawson was quietly pushing her cleaning cart exactly as she had every weekday for nearly 18 years. She stopped when she realized the entire library had gone silent. Slowly, she turned around. The wheels of the cart squeaked once before coming to a stop. Agent Mercer looked directly at her from across the room. His expression changed instantly, not to surprise, but to unmistakable respect. He removed his glasses, straightened his jacket, and without the slightest hesitation, walked the entire length of the library toward the elderly janitor. Every camera followed him. Every donor stepped aside. Every trustee moved out of his path. Preston Langford simply stood frozen, still clutching the manuscript he thought only he had the right to protect, while the one woman he'd spent the previous evening trying to erase suddenly became the only person in the building anyone wanted to see. Agent Mercer stopped just a few feet from Martha, smiled warmly, and said words that nobody in that room, especially Preston, could have possibly expected. "Ma'am, after 18 years, we finally found you." And judging by the expression on Martha's face, she'd known this day was coming all along. Martha looked at aged Daniel Mercer for several long seconds before letting out the kind of quiet sigh that only comes from someone who has spent years making peace with a chapter of life she thought had ended forever. "I wondered if you'd ever stop looking," she said with a gentle smile. Mercer nodded, almost smiling himself. Honestly, ma'am, most of us believed you never wanted to be found. Around them, nobody understood a single word of what was happening. Preston Langford recovered just enough to force his way forward. "Excuse me," he interrupted. "I'm Preston Langford. This university is under my family's stewardship, and I think someone should explain exactly what's going on." Mercer glanced at him for less than a second. "Mr. Langford, I know exactly who you are." Preston straightened his jacket, expecting recognition. Instead, Mercer continued, "Which is one of the reasons we're here." That confidence disappeared from Preston's face almost instantly. Mercer turned back toward Martha. "Would you mind if I introduced everyone to the woman standing in front of them?" Martha hesitated, then gave a small nod. The agent faced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, 18 years ago, before she disappeared from public life, Margaret Dawson was one of the most respected manuscript conservators ever employed by the federal government. She led restoration work on Revolutionary War archives, colonial treaties, presidential collections, and irreplaceable cultural documents that millions of Americans have seen but almost nobody knows who saved." Murmurs spread through the library. Dean Russell Avery stared at Martha as though he'd never seen her before. Caroline slowly lowered her phone. No longer interested in recording, Mercer continued, "When a warehouse fire destroyed part of the National Archive Restoration Center nearly 2 decades ago, she accepted responsibility for a decision that wasn't even hers because several younger conservators would have lost their careers. She resigned quietly, refused every interview, rejected every award, and vanished." Martha looked down at the floor. "I was tired," she said softly. "I wanted a life where nobody needed to know my name." Ben Ramirez whispered under his breath. "All these years," Martha smiled at him. "Cleaning floors pays the bills just as honestly as restoring history." Mercer nodded respectfully. "Except history never forgot you." He reached into a leather folder and removed a document. "Yesterday morning we discovered evidence that one of the country's oldest private manuscript collections contained restoration work so precise that only 3 living experts could have performed it. 2 were overseas. The third had disappeared 18 years ago. We tracked the materials, the adhesive formula, even the microscopic fiber alignment. Every trail led here." Preston suddenly found his voice again. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "None of this changes what happened last night." Mercer slowly turned toward him. "You're right. It doesn't." He paused just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "It makes it considerably worse." Another pair of federal investigators stepped forward, carrying evidence bags. One carefully accepted the restored manuscript from Preston's hands. The other produced copies of security footage requests. "Mr. Langford," Mercer said calmly, "you intentionally destroyed a protected cultural artifact on camera. Whether restoration succeeded afterward is legally irrelevant. We also have video evidence of public harassment, destruction of entrusted property, and possible interference with a federally cataloged manuscript." Preston's face drained of color. "I donated that manuscript." "Ownership and stewardship are 2 different things," Mercer replied. "You owned access. You did not own the nation's history." Caroline looked desperately at her father. "Dad, say something." But for perhaps the first time in his adult life, Preston had nothing left to say. Every person who had laughed the night before now avoided looking him in the eye. The dean slowly stepped toward Martha. His voice shook with embarrassment. "Mrs. Dawson, I owe you an apology. I should have stopped it." Martha looked at him kindly. "Yes, you should have." There wasn't anger in her voice. Somehow that made it hurt even more. One by one, staff members who had watched in silence approached her. Some apologized. Some couldn't find the words. Ben simply hugged her. Martha laughed softly through tears. "Careful, these old bones aren't as sturdy as they used to be." Even Mercer smiled. As investigators escorted Preston toward a private conference room pending formal questioning, he stopped beside Martha one final time. His pride hadn't completely disappeared. "You could have told everyone who you were," he muttered bitterly. Martha looked at him with genuine sadness instead of satisfaction. "If people only treat you with respect after they learn your resume, then they never respected you in the first place." Preston opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. He simply lowered his eyes and kept walking. Later that afternoon, news stations that had planned to celebrate another generous Langford donation led with a very different headline. The story wasn't about a billionaire donor anymore. It was about an elderly custodian whose quiet dignity reminded an entire country that character doesn't wear expensive suits, doesn't arrive with television cameras, and certainly doesn't need to announce itself. A month later, Ashcroft University quietly dedicated a new conservation laboratory, not with Martha's name carved across the building as donors suggested, but with a small bronze plaque she personally requested. It read, "Protects the work. Forget the applause." She still refused interviews. She still worked part-time around books because, as she liked to joke, dust never argues. And old paper is better company than most people. Sometimes students would recognize her from the news and ask whether she regretted staying silent for so many years. She always answered the same way. No, kindness given for recognition isn't kindness. It's advertising. I think about that answer more often than I'd like to admit because the truth is, almost everyone in that library revealed who they really were before they knew Martha's story. Maybe that's the real lesson. We don't actually wait for difficult moments to define our character. Those moments simply introduce it to everyone else. So now, I'd really like to hear what you think. If you had been standing in that library the moment Preston tore those pages apart, would you have spoken up even if it meant risking your own job or reputation? And after learning who Martha truly was, do you think justice was served? Or do you believe the people who stayed silent deserved consequences too? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because stories like this aren't really about old books or wealthy donors. They're about the choices ordinary people make when doing the right thing suddenly becomes uncomfortable. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes integrity matters when nobody thinks you're important.